Good afternoon, everyone. This is Greg Schenk with the Schenk Company coming to you live from sweltering Columbus, Ohio. Another day over 90 degrees here. It may be the hottest in the 39 years that I've lived in Columbus, Ohio, but I'm nice and cool inside. And I am so happy today to have a good friend of mine and special guest, Andrew Zezas, all the way from New Jersey, is going to join us. And we're going to talk a little bit about Tenant Rep, the real estate business, specifically the commercial real estate business, his background, opportunities out there, obstacles out there, and other things that he feels pertinent. Now, Andy and I met, oh my gosh, it's got to be 20 years ago through the SIOR organization. And we both like to speak. So we were both some speakers within SIOR and actually within the NER Speakers Association for many years. So that kind of drew us very close to each other. I always thought he reminded me of Chris Berman, the great ESPN announcer, every time as he sits here laughing, but it's very true. And I just can't tell you how good it is to see you, Andy. Welcome to the podcast. Give us a little bit of background of what's been going on in your life, today with you, with your business, and we'll kick it off.
Greg, thank you so much. It's great to be on the show with you. I'm very excited at the launch of your new show. I think it's going to be a tremendous hit. We have been, not just have we known each other, we've been very good friends for, I think it's actually been a little longer than 20 years. We've had a lot of laughs. We've been through some hard times together. We've watched each other grow and succeed. This is really tremendous. I'm very happy that you decided to do this and very excited to be a part of it. So yeah, let's chat. You want to know a little bit about me. So I have been a corporate real estate advisor and broker right out of college since I was in my early 20s. I thought I was going to take the world by storm with my saxophone and my flute and my voice. And God bless my dad, because he was a prince and he let me go to college on a music focus. And halfway through college, I came home and I said, "Dad, I heard I'm no longer a music major." He said, "Oh, thank God. What are your studies?" And I said, "Economics and finance." And my dad was an accomplished guy, but a Greek immigrant. And he said, "Economics and finance. I'm not sure what that is, but it's not music. Go." So finished my college career, fell into real estate by chance, and have been a real estate advisor now, gosh, I'm embarrassed to say, more than 40 years. Have done all kinds of great stuff around the country in some global markets as well, but I'm really a North America focused professional. I founded a company in 2002 called Real Estate Strategies Corporation, and I still lead that company. We do a lot of great things. What we don't do is a longer list. We don't represent landlords, developers, investors. We're not facilities or property managers. We're not in the construction business. We're not architects, engineers. Anyone who's in the business of real estate is not our client. Our clients strictly are corporate occupants. We advise companies, publicly held companies, privately held companies, large, small, entrepreneurially owned companies, tax-exempt organizations in the acquisition and disposition of real estate that they occupy. The market, as you know, calls us tenant reps, but we're more than tenant reps. We have a proficiency in portfolio strategies, ergo why we do work across North America. We have a proficiency in the real estate implications of buy and sell side M&A, which is a very exciting part of our business, as well as in corporate turnarounds, bankruptcy avoidance, and bankruptcy. So we do some cool things. I work with some really great people, and it's like I said, it's really exciting to be part of this, Greg. Thanks for having me.
Well, again, just you saying that reminds me of how awesome that you are, and the big reason I wanted to have you on, because you do so many things very different than what I do. We're both in commercial real estate, but you're much more on a global setting. I'm much more on a local setting. I'm dealing with mainly privately held companies, not the Fortune 500 or 1000 for the most part. I have done some multi-market work, but not on a day-to-day basis like you're doing it. We're certainly not doing portfolio work, even though we've got experts. And Andy is a proud member of our think tank group that I put together when I left the big firm and started my own. So, just adding on to what yours says, it's 39 years in September for me and 29 years of having the Schenk Company. So both of us have had our own shop here for some considerable time. So let's talk a little bit about big picture, what you see going on in the market today, specifically the office market.
Well, I mean, as you know, Greg, the commercial real estate market's all over the place. It's going in 360 degrees, and it changes pretty frequently. Office market depends upon where you are, what part of the world, whether you're talking about urban or suburban. I mean, over the last few years, we've seen dramatic changes in the office market. We all know what happened during COVID. We all know what happened after COVID. And we all know that a lot of companies in the last couple of years have shifted to a come back to the office focus. Most of them are still on a part-time basis, 3-4 days a week, some on a full-time basis. Nonetheless, we've seen a wholesale downshifting in the volume of office space occupied by the typical company, despite the fact that some are growing. But it was interesting, a year or so ago, one of the largest accounting firms in the world announced that they were consolidating in New York City multiple offices into 380,000 square feet, I think was the number.
I saw that.
Yeah, and you know there was media that said the market's coming back. What the real side of that story, the other side of that story was that while they were consolidating into a single location of 380,000 square feet in a Class A premier, very expensive building.
I think I heard $200 a foot.
Well, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was the rents were huge, the construction budget was huge. But they were consolidating into 380,000 square feet from 790,000 square feet. So, you know, there was a wholesale net give back of space. And what we saw in many of the urban markets in the country, specifically in more traditional markets like New York City, Chicago, and LA, and some other places, a lot of side street buildings, side street office buildings, buildings that were not on the avenues, but would be on, 49th Street or 33rd Street or something like that. Those buildings tended to be smaller. Now, in some markets like Chicago, buildings don't touch each other. But in markets like New York City, they lean up against each other. And, there's one building after another. And those side street buildings tend to be small, 10, 15, 20,000 square foot floor plates. Easily convertible, windows in the front, windows in the back, easily convertible to hotels, apartments, condos, co-ops, some alternative use. And in fact, I think forever, many of those buildings, the leases that those landlords wrote contained conversion clauses whereby if the landlord were to convert a floor, a portion of the building, or the entire building to some use other than office space, he could give the tenant notice and the tenant had to vacate and didn't have any recourse. So, they had a reasonable time, a year or two. But, you sign a 10-year lease, you invest a lot of your own cash in tenant improvement allowances, and then 4 years later, the landlord sends you a 1-year notice and you got to get out of Dodge and you don't have a choice. But what was happening was because so many of those office buildings were poorly performing over the last few years, it made sense to convert them to some alternative use or to consider converting them. And I know there was one very large developer in New York City who raised a fund early on, probably 5 years ago. They raised a fund of about $1.5 billion, which was specifically intended to acquire side street office buildings and convert them to alternative use. So you saw a lot of that going on in New York City. You still see, significant vacancies in some buildings in places like New York and Chicago. In suburban markets, it's a whole different world. In urban markets, they build buildings vertically. They build buildings this way with smaller floor plates. In suburban markets, they go laterally. So, we've seen around the country suburban office buildings with floor plates not of 10, 15, 20,000 square feet, but 80, 100 or more per floor sit vacant, especially the older ones that are functionally obsolete and difficult to do anything with. When you have floor plates that size with, deep floors, even though you have windows on 4 sides, there's not a whole lot you can convert that to. And
Yes.
Some landlords considered turning first floors of those kind of buildings into light industrial, but that didn't really work because you had zoning issues and trucks and cars, and people don't necessarily do well in suburban markets. So we've seen and continue to see a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot, a significant number of office buildings in the suburban markets being raised. The properties being sold for the value of the land. And they're being knocked down, and in their place, retail, hotels, apartments, condos, warehouses, something else. And, in most markets across the country, despite some dips and some ebbs and flows, the industrial market remains pretty strong. Demand is pretty strong in most sectors. There are blips here and there where some subsectors are, questionable, but for the most part, industrial distribution manufacturing seems to be pretty strong. Demand for office is still questionable across the country. Retail, depending upon the type of retail, is spotty. Again, there's pockets here and there, and some of it's strong and some of it's not. So I don't think there's any one direction, and everything I said is different for New York versus Chicago versus LA versus suburban markets versus Florida versus Seattle. So it's a very dynamic time. And for folks like you and me and some of our friendly competitors, we're really in a position to help companies, because no one knows, there's no one answer to this story, and there's no one question. Every company you talk to has different issues. They're all dealing with the same pressures that everybody dealt with in the last 5 years, and now throw in things like tariff uncertainty and how that's going to affect cost of doing business and profitability. And CFOs are scratching their heads because they don't know how this is all going to flush out. Then add a couple of pretty significant wars that are going on around the world, and the implications to commerce of those things, and what could happen and what everyone's afraid might happen. And there's an awful lot of uncertainty going on. So folks like us are in a great position to be able to help companies noodle through some of this stuff, because despite uncertainty over tariffs, despite these horrible wars that are going on, and despite the fears that of what could come out of some of these wars, and all the stuff we've talked about, companies still need to continue. They still need to produce. They still need to pay their bills and generate profit for their investors, and produce great services and products. And real estate's a very significant portion of that. That. And God, folks like us can serve companies in helping them noodle through the alternatives, figure out what possible solutions would best support their financial and operational objectives, and then not only put in place a plan, but go execute. And it's a fun time to be in the real estate business.
Well, I think you're right. And just kind of picking up on a couple things you said. So I just drove by a building yesterday. I didn't even know it was being raised. And it looks like they're going to probably put mixed use or apartments there. And it's in a very high-end suburb that's been very successful, but it was probably a 25-year-old, kind of blasé looking generic office building with the big floor plate, exactly like you said. And then your thing about the how many people coming back to the office. My next door neighbor happens to work for the federal government, and he's been working from home for 5 years, and he just went back to work. And you'll love this. He said they did lay off some people, and obviously a lot of people want the government right size. We're not going to talk politics on this, but he said they have 19 cars in his department that haven't been driven in 5 years, and there's dust this thick on the cars sitting there. So somebody's not been accountable for that. But he does say they're back in the office 5 days a week, which, I follow a lot of statistics. I'm getting more people are doing 3 days than 5 days. My friends that own businesses, most of them are still working remote. I've got a friend that's a big wig in a stock brokerage firm, and I don't think he's been in twice in a year. He goes to Florida for 6 months a year, and he hasn't missed a beat. So people seem to be much more acceptable about Zooming like we are now, being online, being on remote, and having worked remote now for 4 winters for me. It really hasn't affected me one way or another. But I'm interested in getting your feel for with different markets. Are you seeing different amounts of people that are going in the office versus not? Can you get a sense of that, of how many you think are 5 days versus 3 days on some of the assignments that you're working on?
I think it varies by company, it varies by industry and geography as well, Greg. I mean, first of all, let me give you my personal opinion. Right? When we were in COVID, work from home made perfect sense. But once that was over, I've got a pretty strong opinion. We basically turned the asylum over to the inmates, and let employees dictate how they were going to work. And I think that was a big mistake, because everyone said, oh, people are more productive when they're home. I think that the jury came in on that one, and there's a lot of questions about the validity of productivity with people working from home, people getting burned out, people working in their kitchen, people working 3 jobs. If I'm going to pay you to work 5 days, I expect you to work 5 days, right? And you and I grew up with the same work ethic. You go to work, you put in a good day's work, you work hard for your employer, and you get paid. We heard people saying, "What do you mean I have to come into the office? It's going to cost me money to drive into the office, wear and tear on my car, gasoline, tolls." Yeah, it's the way it always was. And for us to continue in this world to permit people to work from home just because,
Yeah,
I think that's a tremendous.
I'm with you. Some companies have put the hammer down, and depending on the job market, vacancy in some markets, they might be able to get away with it. I can tell you in Columbus, where I live, very strong market. It's getting enforced more and more. Let's talk about.
I'm not talking about mobile workers who actually need to be mobile, and I'm talking about people in the office, and it's really tough to do business efficiently when you've got people all over the place. So with that said, we saw, those are my own opinions for what they're worth, but we saw some pretty dramatic changes. I remember meeting with a large pharmaceutical company. They're a global company with North America headquarters here in New Jersey. And during COVID, they 5 years before COVID, they built a brand new headquarters, 400,000 square feet, designed to accommodate about 1,000 employees. And during COVID, they had 100 people a day. And I spoke to the CFO. I said, "Well, how do you want to look at this? Either you have 10 times more space than you're actually utilizing, or you're paying 10 times more than you thought you would per employee. How do you want to look at it?" Either way, it's a horrible, horrible scenario. COVID is long gone. They are up to about 500 or 600 a day in a building that was designed for 1,000 people. So
it was probably designed for a single tenant, not a multi-tenant, too.
That's correct. It would be very difficult to convert that building to a multi-tenant.
That's a big issue I've seen in a lot of things, that the cost to go back. Number one, the cost to convert it to residential doesn't work in every building, and in our market, very few on there. But yeah, I think any corporate headquarters. How do you change it? Could you? Then you have security to deal with and all that.
All kinds of issues, but here, the punchline is they designed this thing for 1,000 people. They've got 500 or 600 a day coming in. So, all right, they're no longer paying 10 times what they thought, but they're paying twice what they thought they'd be paying. And that's a huge financial inefficiency and a great opportunity for folks like us to serve that company and help them figure out, how do you mitigate this cost? And there are ways to mitigate costs. There's multiple ways to do it. It's not converting it to residential, but these are big companies looking to generate profit. And when you've got 200,000 square feet of surplus office space just in one facility, that's a huge negative financial impact.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen again, I read a lot every day, that there's some trophy office buildings in major cities are on the market for 30 to 50 cents on the dollar. Today, I follow a gentleman that speaks out of Atlanta. He posted one in Raleigh, which you'd think would be a very strong market. North Carolina's done very well. And he said it's like $7 million less than what you could normally get it for, which, seems like a huge number. But almost every day I'm seeing different cities, more downtown than the suburbs, at least from what I've seen on there, just unbelievable opportunities. But are the people stepping up? Do they understand the cost, even if they're taking it over as another office user, the cost to update it and get it? I don't think they do.
No, most companies are shocked at the cost. I mean, you're heading in the right direction here, because that's a very significant issue. The cost of materials has gone up dramatically. The cost of labor has gone up dramatically. And, I remember when I got in the business, I used to be able to build office space for 15 to 20 bucks a foot, plain vanilla office space. That was a long time ago. And, now it's, $200 to $300 a square foot by the time you're done with construction and furniture, fixtures, and equipment. It's incredibly expensive. And I'm just talking about leasehold improvements and FF&E. I'm not talking about base building improvements. It's a dramatic cost that companies aren't prepared for. Now, with all this stuff we're talking about, throw in another issue that, you've got a lot of debt that's expiring on buildings. And when you've got an underperforming or a non-performing building where the debt's going to expire, And the only way to replace that inexpensive debt from 5 or 10 years ago is with expensive debt based upon the interest rates that have been prevalent in the last few years. What's going to happen? Those buildings aren't going to be refinanced, especially if they're functionally obsolete or challenged from a vacancy perspective. So, the likelihood is you're going to see buildings go back to the bank. You're going to see lenders take over properties, and they're going to be saddled with.
But do you think they actually want them back? They certainly don't have the expertise, someone like you to helping them. And I would think that would be the last thing they want.
That's correct.
They think they would try to do some kind of workout.
That's correct.
Because I heard one number like 800 billion worth of commercial loans coming due this year, and many banks are trying to push them a year so we don't have a big depression within the office space. I mean, like you said earlier, almost every other sector of the market is doing pretty darn good. I mean, in our market, even office is doing good, just not downtown. But in almost all the markets we track, it seems like most sectors. I mean, medical's doing great, self-storage is doing great, data centers just going, gangbusters to the roof. Most retail, other than some malls, are doing very good. Industrial
flex buildings are doing very well. I mean, we're in some sectors of Pennsylvania where we're looking for small flex buildings for a particular client of ours that does work internationally. And in a market where there are a couple hundred buildings, there's 2 alternatives that work for them because everything's so tight. So yeah.
So that sounds the same thing that I'm hearing. So for people out there, you said it once, I say it every single day: putting together a strategic plan. The biggest thing I see, Andy, is too many companies spend too much time working in the business and don't take the time to take their head out of the sand, take a step back and work on it and put together that plan. Or maybe they're afraid because things are changing so rapidly. Are they going to force their people back in the office? What is the right head count? What kind of space do they want? Do they want to build that Taj Mahal, $200 a foot like the accounting company? Or are they like 90% of my clients that want functionally efficient space for the lowest possible cost they can?
That's correct. And you and I were talking offline earlier, and you were mentioning to me a client of yours that's looking to buy another company. I mean, that's a whole other conversation with respect to real estate, because when we rolled out our buy and sell side M&A real estate service, we did a lot of research. We spoke to a lot of CFOs, and we already knew the answer, but we needed to do the research anyway. And we spoke to a lot of CFOs and a lot of deal guys and asked them, how often is real estate addressed in advance when it comes to an M&A transaction, buy or sell side? And the answer was almost never. And, the traditional story is that, the deal gets done and, someone says, oh, did anybody look at the leases? And, the junior attorney on the buy side gets used to get a box of leases. Now he gets a big file and, get this reviewed by tomorrow. And it's just a checklist, yes, the lease is in force. Yes, the documents are here. Yes, the rent is $30 a square foot. But historically, nobody was doing a dive into the real estate to assess risk and opportunity. When you're selling either side, let's talk about when you're buying. When you're buying a business, you may be buying real estate, you may be acquiring leases, and the question is, what's your appetite? Do you want to invest in real estate? Or do you want to invest in a business? Are the leases long-term, short-term? Are there problems with the leases? Are there hidden risks and issues? Are there opportunities to make the deal even better and to drive greater value in the deal by virtue of what's buried in that lease? And Greg, if you don't identify a risk before you close on the purchase, that risk sticks around and very often gets bigger. Risk never goes away, it just moves, right? So if you don't identify a risk and you wait till you close and then you do a deeper dive into the real estate, you may find out that risk is a lot bigger than it was and could negatively enhance the deal that you thought you made. Conversely, if you don't identify an opportunity before you close and grab it and capitalize on it, that opportunity will likely go away or not be as big as you might thought it would be. So we're very, very big on advanced planning on the buy side. If you're buying a business, let's do a deep dive into the real estate that you may acquire. Let's make sure it fits your real estate profile, because you mentioned to me earlier, a company that doesn't like to own real estate. Well, if our buyer client doesn't like to own real estate, they shouldn't be acquiring real estate that's owned in an acquisition. So how do you address that? Well, there's got to be a plan, and maybe those buildings need to be converted to leases, and a seller of the business needs to play landlord. Or maybe we don't acquire those buildings at all, and we have them extracted from the transaction. And the same thing's true on the sell side. If you're going to market to sell a business or a division, to divest of a company, taking a deep dive into the real estate that you will transfer in your sale vis-a-vis the buyer's real estate profile is really important in preparing to go to market. And that's not something that you should wait to do until you go to market. Too many companies go to market and then the buyer says, well, here's how I want to adjust the real estate. And they scramble and they either lose value or lose a deal or something else happens. And here's a great example. When we were doing our research, we spoke to the president of an acquisitions group that was captive to one of the largest telecom companies in the United States. And he was a friend of ours, and we called him up and said, listen, this is the direction we're going in. We've always been providing real estate buy and sell side M&A services, but we're going to formalize it and offer it as a service. And I described it to him, and he encouraged us to go. He says, Andy, there aren't too many people doing this, and you're going to do well with it. And he said, I wish we had you with us a year and a half ago. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, we got ourselves in a bit of a mess. And I said, well, you've got a pretty substantial M&A group and a substantial real estate group. He says, yeah, but M&A and real estate don't really talk that much. All right, so I asked him what happened. They chose to divest of another telecom company that they owned, which was headquartered, which in and of itself was a large company, and was headquartered in another part of the country, on the West Coast. They put together their deal profile, and they identified the kind of buyer who would likely buy that company, and they went to market. And they were spot on in terms of the deal profile. And they found a buyer pretty quickly, and it fit their intended profile. And the buyer wanted the entire company, except the buyer said, we don't want your LA headquarters office tower. And the seller, not prepared for that conversation, did what big companies typically do. Don't worry, we'll make it worth your while. No, you don't understand. We don't want the tower. Yeah, we know. We'll make it worth your while. And that conversation kept going back and forth for about 8 or 9 months. And here the seller was ready to close on the deal and thought they had a deal. And they got a notice from the buyer at the 11th hour saying, you're not listening. We told you time and time again, we don't want the headquarters tower. I don't care about the incentives you're offering us. You're jamming it down our throat. Deal's dead.
Wow.
And I said to the president of the acquisitions group, I said, so what'd you do? He said, well, it took us some time. We got the buyer back to the table. We had to extricate the office tower from the deal the way he asked, and we ended up selling him the business. I said, okay, so it worked out. He says, well, not really. He said, the buyer used our mistake to retrade on the purchase of the business, and we got dinged pretty bad. And then we sold the $85 million headquarters tower for under $50 million. And he said, I wish we had you guys involved to help us figure this out. And because our recommendation always is, as you're putting together your deal profile, you want to take your company or your division or your subsidiary to marketplace. Let's take a look at the real estate you have. Let's take a look at the kind of buyer who you think is likely to acquire your business and identify the likely real estate profile of that buyer. So, for example, if you think you're going to sell your company to private equity, they're going to want you most likely to leave the business in place. So there's got to be some real estate there. But unless it's a private equity group that also invests in real estate, the likelihood is they're not going to want to own and pay for your own real estate. So if you think they're going to want to leave your operations in place and you own the real estate, do you want to be a landlord? And maybe we should structure that kind of offering now. Or should you sell the building today to an investor and offer a lease on that basis? There's no wrong answer in that regard. Conversely, if you sell to a strategic buyer and you think that strategic buyer is not going to want to leave your operations in place and they're just going to want to scoop up your IP and your customer list and move it to the other side of the country, and you own real estate or you have real estate leases that are long-term, you're going to have to figure out what to do with those properties before you go to market with your business. So like you said before, it's all about planning, intelligent planning, and then ultimately executing on an intelligent plan.
I just can't believe, and we're both saying the exact same thing. We're both been in this business, a long time. How many companies don't have a plan? Like you said, here's a big telecom company, and I've got, hundreds of stories like that of nightmares that we could write books on for companies that did things. I mean, I've had companies buy buildings and outgrew it before they went in it because they didn't do a simple space plan. And then they'd come to me after the fact, well, what can I do with this? What can I do with that? Well, it seems most of my clients, for some reason, the attorney or their accountant or advisor sends them to me after the fact instead of before. And obviously, there's not a whole lot we can do about it. But I think for our listeners that are out there, most of my clients, I'm trying to get 12 to 18 months before anything. I don't know for your M&A, do you have to start 2 years before? How long are you typically starting before they're even buying the business or the company? Is there a norm for that, or?
Yeah, it's different. It's different for every client. I mean, sometimes it's 3 months, sometimes it's pushing a year and a half, 2 years. It really depends.
How long does it take to get financing for a business typically when you're doing that?
It's not too dissimilar from what we experience on the real estate side.
Oh, that's good to hear. And then how about, is there plenty of money out there for that?
There's plenty of money. There's plenty of dry powder sitting on the sidelines looking to acquire. Absolutely.
Well, I've seen that on my investment end too. There is a lot of money out there, but they're certainly more cautious. Obviously, the returns aren't what they used to be because of where the interest rates are on there. So that's very interesting to hear.
And everything we just discussed, from some wars that are going on in the world, and tariffs and all kinds of other stuff that's happening. That's all putting question marks in the minds of not only CFOs in terms of how do we deal with this, but investors who would acquire their companies. How do we deal with this? How are you dealing with this? And how is it affecting valuation? We've seen a number of M&A transactions that were in the planning stage over the last 6, 8, 9 months that were about to move forward into go to market, go on hold because the expectation is that valuations have dropped because of uncertainty.
I could see that. So I met a gentleman in Miami that got a client from Sweden who's a billionaire that said he wanted to invest in the US in real estate. And once all this stuff has happened, he said, look, I just put everything on hold. I'm not comfortable. So here was a guy ready to make a major move on there. Although I still think there's a lot of foreign investors that think it's a hell of a lot safer in the US than it is any place else. I've been to about 12 states this year. I've done a lot of traveling this year, and I've seen a lot of cranes. I've seen a lot of good things going on, even though there's, some stress and strife. Let's change tracks here a little bit. Do you have a feel for the stuff you're doing now? How many people are leasing buildings versus buying buildings, whether it's office or industrial?
I think that the same approach that's existed for a very long time is existing. Privately held companies, when they're successful, especially entrepreneurially owned companies, are very keenly interested in owning the real estate they occupy. That hasn't changed. Publicly held companies recognize that it's just too costly to own real estate that's not strategic in nature. So I don't know too many large or small companies that own their corporate headquarters anymore, unless they have for a very long time. Let me say that differently. I don't see a lot of companies that are looking to own corporate headquarters. They're looking to acquire headquarters through lease on a lease basis. Regional office facilities, same thing. Not the kind of property a company would typically want to own. Warehousing, retail space, but when it comes to the kind of facilities where the infrastructure outpaces the value of the real estate, when you're talking about technology properties, when you're talking about data centers, when you're talking about manufacturing facilities, properties that are deemed strategic, very often companies will consider investing in real estate because the real estate is, I won't say insignificant, but very often considerably less valuable than what's inside it.
Yeah.
And what comes out of it. So, long-term control without dealing with market fluctuations associated with leasing for those kind of companies, even publicly held companies, if the property is deemed strategic, they'll consider owning it.
So again, most of my clients are privately held, but I'm going to say probably 80% renew or restructure their lease.
Oh, yeah, you're seeing a lot of.
So 20% are moving, but 20% are moving to a new lease, not buying. Very, very few, because either they didn't plan or they don't want to spend the cash or they don't have the cash. But are you seeing the same type of, as far as the percent of your clients that are renewing or restructuring existing leases are going?
Well, that's a good point, Greg. Yes, we are. We're seeing a lot of companies. Well, first of all, let's back up. Is it only a financial issue when it comes to relocating or staying in place? No, it's a significant financial issue, but it's not the only issue. Moving is disruptive. It requires a tremendous amount of planning nowadays in advance. A lot of strategic decision making, and that takes people and resources, and has a cost associated with it. And unless there's a substantial reason and a substantial reason driving a relocation decision and a substantial benefit that would be derived from relocating, you're absolutely right. Most companies are saying, does it make sense for us just to stay here and modify in place and restructure, and in some cases retain the same, near the same rental rate, or have a modest or even a significant increase and not have to bear the burden of a wholesale pickup and relocation, unless there's a real reason to do it. Now, if you're talking about going from, a building that supports 1,000 people to needing a building that only supports 500 people, that might be a significant reason.
Yeah, that's pretty huge. But I've had a few. I should back up. I actually have a move checklist that I send out to companies, because a lot of times they don't have a clue of who all they need. Moving the IT, getting an actual mover, phones, furniture, wiring, cable, all that. So I try to help my clients to be able to take care of all that. You want a Coke machine? I'll get you a Coke machine, the whole 9 yards. But I've got a client now that's
Can you give me a Coke machine?
I can get you a Coke machine,
right,
just for you. So I've got a client now that needs to downsize, and it's not really a type of space that can be subdivided and put another tenant in there. They could probably privately do it, but it's not the type of thing where they're going to be putting up load-bearing walls or demising it. And so they're kind of in a rock and a hard spot with like 2,000 feet more than they need. And the landlord's pretty much saying, pound salt, go somewhere else if you think you can get it. And it's a flex space building. They're in a very nice, and they got the city to put in high fiber cable, which not every area is doing. So they've been in there now 7 years, and the landlord's not playing ball with them. So some landlords know that if they know the market enough, or if their listing agent is very good. But I've got quite a few that I'll say have tried to right size, not to the dramatic of your 1,000 to 500 employees, but enough that it's upsetting, but they either can't find the right scenario, or it still costs too much to move. Or like in our case, there's some other properties out there, but they're so crappy they wouldn't want to go in them.
Well, you know what? You're 100% right, Greg, but add one more element to that. You've got some landlords who you're absolutely right. They know that they don't have to play ball, and they can just sit back and let the tenant deal with his own problems, which fundamentally I have an issue with, because I've always contended that landlords should be in the customer service business, because their tenants are their customers. Not sure the best landlords get that. Not all landlords do. But given some of the things we talked about earlier with what's going on in the world, and uncertainty affects landlords as well. And given the fact that a lot of office tenants are cutting back, and a lot of buildings aren't performing, and landlords are faced with significant debt exposure from expiring mortgages that can only be replaced at more costly rates, some landlords can't help their tenants. They just don't have the wherewithal. And it's tough to figure out what that real story is, and folks like you and me get engaged to figure that out and advise our clients accordingly. We're regularly advising our clients to be incredibly cautious about doing any transaction. Traditionally, landlord says, "Well, if you want to be in my building, Mr. Tenant, give me your financials." And we're asking the same question of landlords. hey, here are our client will send you their financials, but we need to see yours.
So that's leads into a great story that I have from last year. I have a client, a financial planner in what used to be one of the nicest suburban buildings. And the occupancy dropped below 50%. The landlord was not able to get a loan from his bank to do any tenant improvements. My client was merging with another company and wanted to knock out a wall and add 2 offices, very small, like 40-some thousand dollars a build out. We couldn't get a nickel. But what we did, being the creative guys that we are, we got 8 months free rent, and then the tenant paid for the build out. We got another 8 months free rent because the market was so soft, and we got his rent reduced.
I remember you told me that story. That was
so 5-year lease, and this is not a big tenant. 5-year lease, 16 months free rent, 8 of it because the landlord was not able. And I was worried about honestly getting paid from a guy that says, look, we're 40% occupied. But this building was so nice, that just shows you how much the market had changed. But most people and most brokers, they see a beautiful building. They're not going to think the landlord's hurting. They don't know if it's a sole proprietor or a REIT, and that's obviously where our expertise and knowing the other agents and their background. That's the first question I'm asking the broker these days is, can your landlord provide build out allowance? Because if not, my clients are probably not going to go there because they don't want to come out of pocket 1 penny unless it's a medical client. Most of my clients have never paid a penny of build out. So I think this is something for the foreseeable future, especially as interest rates went up. And as we talked about earlier, hopefully that's not going to make the shit hit the fan too much with buildings being foreclosed on, but it's gonna. And certainly in our downtown, we just had a building change hands to an out-of-town landlord that bought it really for 20 or 30 cents on the dollar. But I don't think our downtown office demand is strong enough that if they don't have deep enough pockets for 4 or 5 years, I think it's going to be a huge challenge for them. And I'm sure you're seeing that in some of the markets that you're working on as well.
Well, we are, and I'm going to give you something that's on the flip side of this for your listeners and those who view your podcast. We had the issues of landlord bankruptcy go a lot deeper, or prospective landlord bankruptcy. We asked one of our clients, we were doing some portfolio work for a client based in the Midwest, and they had a traditional, I'll call old-fashioned real estate executive running their real estate. And they could have been a lot more efficient. And they had about 150 locations around the United States. And we asked him a very important question. Given what's going on in the marketplace and the financial instability of companies as well as landlords, we need to make sure that your portfolio is secure. What percentage of your portfolio, of your leases, contain non-disturbance agreements? And his response was, remind me again what a non-disturbance agreement is? I said, wow, okay, well, here's what you're looking for. Oh yeah, I think we got some of those. Well, okay, we through the CFO directed him to do a dive into the entire portfolio, and he came back and said about 74% of their portfolio did not have non-disturbance agreements. And for those of your audience who aren't familiar with that, a non-disturbance agreement is really, really important, and is not something a tenant automatically gets. I know you know that, Greg, and certainly smaller tenants are challenged to get non-disturbance agreements, but it's something that needs to be gotten and requested and negotiated by the tenant at the outset of the lease. And a non-disturbance agreement is not an agreement between tenant and landlord. It's an agreement between tenant and lender. And the tenant, when negotiating the lease, needs to demand that the landlord secure a non-disturbance agreement between lender and tenant, and agree to secure the same kind of agreement with any future lenders that the landlord may do business with. And what that non-disturbance agreement does is it's basically a statement on behalf of the lender that if the landlord should be displaced and should either go bankrupt or default or turn the building over to the landlord is no longer the landlord, and the lender steps into the shoes of the landlord. non-disturbance agreement is a commitment by the lender not to disturb the lease and to permit it to continue to run in force. Now, most tenants would say, well, what do I need that for? If I signed a contract with a landlord and I'm paying my rent and I'm not in default, aren't I protected? The answer is no, because the lease is a contract between tenant and landlord, where the landlord conveys to the tenant the right to use the property. But that right only, that ability for the landlord to convey that right only exists so long as the landlord owns the building and has the right to convey that right. If the landlord gets displaced and is no longer landlord of the building, that contract can be voided immediately upon notice by whomever steps into the shoes of the landlord, absent a non-disturbance agreement.
So have you seen a new buyer come in that situation and kick tenants out?
It doesn't happen a lot, but all you need is for it to happen to your company once, right?
Yeah.
And I've had CFOs say to me, well, go back to the same conversation. If we're paying rent and we're not in default and we're not messing up the landlord's building, why would he want to remove
Maybe
it?
it's an owner user buying it,
Could be a lot of
or
reasons.
maybe a major tenant wants to expand.
That's right. I'm moving into the building. I'm buying it because I'm putting my company in there and you're in the way. Or I'm an investor and I'm buying it and I want to bring another tenant in and you're in the way. Or I'm buying the building because I want to convert it to something else and you're in the way. Or I'm buying the building and I think you're paying under market, and if you come to an above market rent, I'll consider letting you stay. And there's a whole lot more. So
That's a great point, Andy. So I have a 44-point lease checklist that I actually teach in one of my CE classes, and I'm going to actually have to double check. I don't remember if that's in there off the top of my head, but I can't think of a client that I've had it happen to them. Obviously, I've seen buildings go into default. Okay, before we wrap up here, there's a couple other things on there. Let's talk about your crystal ball. I don't know how clear it is now. What do you think we're going to see in the future here in the commercial real estate business and in the markets that you're covering?
Wow, crystal ball. I mean, I'm not an economist, so the real estate market rises and falls based upon what's going on in the economic world. And we talk to a number of economists. In fact, in our magazine that we publish, CFO Intelligence Magazine, we have an economist from MetLife Wealth Management who writes a column every quarter, and we asked that economist and others on a periodic basis what's going on, and we get opposing perspectives, right? There was going to be a recession. There's not going to be a recession. Now there might be a recession, but we don't think there's going to be a recession. My own personal opinion, based upon what I'm seeing, and again, I'm not an economist, and I'm listening to some really, really bright people, those who are economists, those who are running some substantial companies. I think there's a potential for things to go either really bad or either really well. I'm an optimist. When things get bad, they tend to eventually get better. When things get great, they eventually go back in the other direction. So, that pendulum keeps swinging back and forth. My hope is that what's going on in the world these days between Russia and Ukraine and Israel and Iran, that those things will settle, that the killing will stop, at least for the short term, and there will be, and the economic issues associated with the global trade discussions and the tariffs will settle. And even if they settle at higher costs, companies will figure out, they'll be certain, and they'll know what has to be done, and they'll be able to figure out what's next. The problem right now is there's too much uncertainty because of all those issues and others in the marketplace. And what we've discussed on this call, from a landlord perspective, I don't know if I'm going to be able to refinance my building because it just costs too darn much. So there's so much uncertainty in the economic world and in the real estate world these days that people don't know, executives don't know how to make decisions in many cases. So once some of these things start settling, even if they settle up here, companies and the executives who run them we'll be able to make decisions. And maybe that means we close up shop. Maybe that means we sell. Maybe that means we buy. But we'll be able to figure it out. And I think my hope is that by the end of this year, some of these very serious issues that are affecting the world will settle out, and there'll be more stability in the economy, and companies will be able to figure out what to do, and that'll trickle down to the real estate market. I don't think the office market's going to change dramatically for the better. I don't think companies are going to come back and start occupying a lot of office space. I think that ship has sailed, and I think we're going to continue to see a lot of office conversions. I think we're to something else. I think we're, especially as the office market stock around the country ages and matures and becomes more and more functionally obsolete. I think you're going to see a drive for greater operating and financial efficiencies by companies, which means shedding surplus and excess space. But I think at the end, I think it'll work out for the better, because we're a country that's constantly about renewal and growth and what's next.
Yeah, I would agree 100% with that. And I would say when companies are shedding those things, there's unbelievable opportunity.
That's correct.
Companies that want to dip their toe in a market they're not in now can either get a sublease space at 50 cents on the dollar, or maybe buy an entire building at 50 cents. An investor that hasn't invested, that has deep enough pockets, they can certainly get these things around the country in a lot of different product types. Before we let you go, tell me about, maybe you have a book you'd like to recommend that for people that are either in the business, maybe wanting to get in the business. Not too many people are as crazy as you and me to be in it this long, but do you have any words of wisdom or a book you'd like to recommend?
Well, thanks. I couldn't miss the opportunity for a shameless plug. I mean, one of the magazine that I publish on a national basis is called CFO Intelligence Magazine.
I see it behind your head there. If you move your head just to the right, I can see a little better.
We publish CFO Intelligence Magazine quarterly, and it's distributed to about 20,000 CFOs around the country. It's a great publication, contains some really deep, we do a deep dive into the minds of the CFO, and how they achieve what they achieved, and what the risks and what the challenges are, and what some of their accomplishments are. I just bought a book that I haven't begun reading, but I'm excited to read it. It's called Selling Buildings. And it's a book that's co-published by Santa Massimo, who is a real estate speaker, and oh man, I just drew a blank.
Bob Knackel.
Thank you.
Well, guess what?
Knackel,
I just bought it as well, and I'm going to read it on my plane over to Greece. So even though I don't do listings, I met him at a CCIM conference last fall and really hit it off with the guy. Talk about a great personality. Him and you got a lot in common there. So that is a good book. So I have a book list that I give out. So anybody of our listeners that wants it, tell them, Andy, number one, how can they best get a hold of you?
Well, the way to find me is to reach me is, first of all, visit our website at realstrat.com, or contact me at andrew.zezas@realstrat.com. I'm around. I'm all over LinkedIn, and I'm all over social media, and it would be great to chat with anyone who needs guidance or needs help. One last thing I'll offer as well is, because we don't have a warehouse full of surplus products that we can donate, the only thing like you and I have is our time and our talent and our energy. So years ago, we launched something called Pro Bono Real Estate Services. And for bona fide charitable not-for-profit organizations who need help in figuring out what their real estate issues are, our first course is to figure out if we can do it for them for free. And in most cases, good organizations are populated by well-meaning people who don't have a lot of real estate knowledge, and they really just need somebody to answer questions for them. And we take those calls on a frequent basis, and we offer guidance, and we get deeply involved, and we've accomplished some pretty cool things. So if any of your listeners are bona fide charitable not-for-profits and they need somebody to answer questions for them without a hidden agenda, very, very happy to take those calls and be of service, especially if they're people who know you, Greg.
Well, that's awesome. That makes my heart glee. Unfortunately, there's obviously a lot of pain in this world from people suffering, and everybody needs help with that. Thank you again, Andy. If you didn't get your questions answered today, please email me, greg@shankcompany.com. If you have other topics you'd like to hear on future podcasts, please let me know that as well. And again, thank you, Andrew. And I can't wait to see and hear about your trip after we both go on our trip. So God bless and have a great rest of your summer.
Greg, this has been great. Congratulations on your podcast. Congratulations on your success, brother. I can't wait to see you. Be well. God bless.
God bless.
Take care.